Hello. Divine Code reading for July 10th, pages 65 and 66. We're in the prohibition against making a new religion or adding a commandment. Finishing the paragraph from yesterday, anyone who does not accept them is liable. This is the Jewish commandment to compel the nations to accept the Noahide commandments. The Jews have a requirement that they compel the nations, and this is in the Bible. Where if Israel goes to a city and they ask the city for peace, and the different options that are available to the city, that's understood to be that it's necessary to compel the city to follow the 7 laws. And if they don't follow them, they're liable. There's also in this case, in the biblical case, the opportunity for the nation to leave the area. We know in the Messianic era, the entire world will be under the jurisdiction of Israel, and at that point, a person that rejects the 7 laws would be liable under court. This commandment to Moses to compel all the nations of the world to accept the 7 Noahide precepts is not incumbent merely upon the Jews, but also upon the nations of the world. Anyone who has the power to compel others to act in a correct way is obligated to do so. If there is a court or government that has the authority, they must establish these 7 commandments as an order and statute. And if an individual has the ability to persuasively explain to Gentiles about their obligation, he is required to do so from this commandment to Moses. So the commandment to Moses is primarily on the Jewish people, but is also upon the non-Jews. The non-Jews have a obligation through the court, through the mitzvah of establishing courts of justice. If they can establish courts of justice, they should do so. And even without that, individuals should be persuading, explaining to people the proper way to live. Halakha 2. The general rule is that it is forbidden for a Gentile, an individual, and certainly a community which observes the Noahide code, to add precepts from another religion or to create a commandment based on his own decision. If he wants, he can seek proper conversion to become a Jew in all respects, or he can remain observant of the Noahide code without adding or subtracting from the Noahide commandments that he observes. So that the system is set up a certain way. We have the non-Jew who has 7 commandments. Now these commandments branch out into a wide variety of things, but there are 7. It's understood that there's 7 precepts, 7 basic rules that govern the non-Jew. And the Jew has 613. Now different Jews have different mixtures of the 613 based on their circumstance. The non-Jew has 7 that apply to him. There's complex ways of understanding this that are understood in other books, that the 7 interact or they overlay a large number of the 613. And therefore, this following of the 7 can involve much of the 613, but it's not considered part of the 613 when the Noahide does this, when the non-Jew does this. It's considered that he's following the 7. A non-Jew can, if he feels a need, convert to becoming a Jew, and then he would have the 613. And there's another status that exists in the halakha is called a Eved Kanani, where he takes on the slave who can take on, or who is required, I should say, to take on a certain number of the 613. That's a separate thing that applies to this Eved Kanani. That is not what's being talked about in the Divine Code, and that's an area that needs to be looked into more, but it's not applicable here. Here we're saying there's 7 Noahide commandments, and that's what there is. A Gentile who delves deeply into other areas of the Torah is liable. And this is explained elsewhere. It's other areas of Torah that don't apply to the non-Jew. And as we'll learn in chapter 5 in a couple of weeks, what can apply to the non-Jew is a very broad area. But a person that's looking into just for the sake, he's just learning it for the sake of learning Torah, is liable. Although, as explained later on, that's liable through the hand of heaven. It's not through a court. And should only be deeply involved in the study of the Noahide Code, in which he was commanded. See later in chapter 5. Also, if a Gentile abstains from weekday activities and makes a Shabbos for himself, even on a weekday, he is liable. In rabbinic speak, making a Shabbos for oneself involves, well, very specifically, it involves refraining from certain categories of work, and it gets complicated and can confuse people. For example, a person would not be allowed to open a box in such a way that he breaks writing on the box, but he would be allowed to move furniture up and down stairs all day long, and that would be considered work. So when it says making a Shabbos for oneself, it's specifically speaking of refraining from those areas of work that are understood to be with the Jewish Shabbos, associated with the Jewish Shabbos, that refraining. This obviously includes one who establishes a holy day for himself that is similar to the holy days on Shabboses of the Jews, which are religious holidays, such as a holy assembly day, during which he prohibits himself from work. Since this is creating for himself a new religion, not only is taking on a Shabbos day forbidden, but even setting aside any day for a specific religious observance or statute such as one who establishes for himself a time to eat a specific food as a precept, that is, eating unleavened bread on Passover, or to fast on a specific day, such as the Jewish fast day of Yom Kippur, and the like. So not only would it be not allowed for the non-Jew to take on a Shabbos, where he refrains from the certain categories of work that are prohibited to a Jew on Shabbos. But if he were to take on as a religious precept to do certain things on a particular day. Now the question comes up: we have in America, we on the day of Thanksgiving we sit around and we eat turkey and cranberries and that. Would that be considered a religious holiday? And it depends on how it's being treated. If it's being treated that the turkey is eaten as a precept, and if a person decided to eat a hamburger that day, they would be considered doing some egregious sin, then perhaps that might be a religious holiday because it's being treated as a precept. But if it's just simply a custom, then it might be allowed. It's just something the community does out of fun or out of some sense of community. Then it would be okay, according to this. Even if he did not also set it aside as a Shabbat or a festival day, that is, refraining from work. This is considered creating a festival and a religion from his own comprehension. However, if he sets up for himself a day of rest from work, not as a holiday, but as a break from work, it is permissible, for he is not establishing it as a religious precept from his own comprehension. So a person decides that he needs a day off of work. A lot of labor laws require a day off during the week. It's written into the legal system to protect workers from being worked every day without ever being able to take a break. In those cases, because it's given as a logical precept, and it's for the sake of the individual and it's for the sake of society, it's not as a religious idea, then it would be permitted. If a Gentile does involve himself deeply in Torah study beyond the Noahide commandments, or if he curtails his activity to observe a Shabbat day, or if he adds a commandment for himself, a court may chastise him and inform him that he is liable to death by the hand of heaven for this. But he may not be severely punished by the court. So these areas are not clear-cut. I mean, Thanksgiving is not a clear-cut thing. A lot of people, they see Thanksgiving as a religious holiday. Other people, they just see it as a day of fun. December 25th, that's traditionally a religious holiday. But today's secular society, a lot of people, they just see it as a day to make snowmen. So it's not, these things are not clear-cut, and they have to be discussed. It's not an area for the court to come down hard on. It's an area for the court to discuss it with the person and to try to help the person out to live correctly. Assuming the person has already understood that he's taken on the 7 commandments, which was at the beginning of today's reading. Halakha number 3. Any commandment connected to a Jewish holy day, such as eating unleavened bread on Passover, or waving a palm frond, a lulav, or sitting in a Sukkot booth on Sukkot, is forbidden for a Gentile to observe specifically on those days, because he is making a holy day that he is not commanded in. And it is forbidden to make one's own holy day because of the prohibition against making a new religion. So the Jews have lots of holidays, days that they're told by God, do this or don't do that, and this is on a specific day. It's commanded for that day. And there's all sorts of things that are, books and books that are written on these topics, and there's lots of things that are taught on them. A Gentile, a non-Jew, cannot take on these days in that manner. For example, to eat unleavened bread specifically on the first night of Passover, or not to eat foods made from moistened flour during Passover, or to only eat in a Sukkot booth during the Sukkot because of the Jewish festival. But if a Gentile wants to eat unleavened bread or sit in a Sukkot booth for his pleasure, that is, if he likes to eating unleavened bread or sitting in a Sukkot booth because of the heat of the day, he is allowed to. This is so even during the Jewish holy days, since he does not intend at all to observe the Jewish commandment. But if he does the action only for his own satisfaction, he is not establishing a commandment for himself, as mentioned above in topics 3.2. So it's okay to do these things. If he's doing it not as a religious precept, he's not taking it on as a religious precept. He's doing it because it follows reasonably to do it. And even if it's something like, giving charity on Purim, he can give charity. He can even give charity because he knows that it's proper to do so. But he can't take it on as a mitzvah, as a commandment, as a precept. He's doing it because it makes sense to do so. It's a proper thing to do so. However, if a Gentile is invited to the home of a Jew on the night of Passover, he is served unleavened bread as the available food, or he is invited to a meal of a Jew's Sukkot booth on Sukkot. There is no prohibition involved in this for the Gentile, since he is eating out of the honor of his Jewish host and not as a Jewish ritual for himself. So there's allowances made. I mean, if the Jew is doing an activity on a particular day, the non-Jew comes over and hangs out with his friend and participates in some of the activity, that's okay to do, as long as he's not doing it as taking on the religious precept. He's doing it because that's what he's doing with his friend. And I would suggest that he can even learn the philosophical, the lessons associated with it. If he's sitting in the Sukkot booth, he can learn about what it means to the Jew to sit in a Sukkot booth. But he's not doing it himself. He's going over and he's participating in something that his friend is doing, and that's allowed. Thank you.